Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last session of the plenary sessions today. I've got two guys here who I do know, actually. One of them I've worked with closely for quite a few years. So we've got Zeke Vogts and Christian Unger. Christian I've worked with when he was working at the University of Queensland. They both work at the Translational Research Institute now, which is the largest medical research facility in the Southern Hemisphere, which I didn't realise. And they're talking about the gaps in the agreement, the things outsourcing services hide from you. So please put your hands together for Christian and Zeke.
Thank you. And then it stopped working. Here we go. So when we're talking about a gap, the general definition is a wide difference in character and attitude. What we're talking about specifically is mismatching or missing requirements that are not identified going into an agreement, an SLA, an outsourcing agreement in particular. The examples that we've experienced is mostly down to differences in meaning, a desire to maximize profits by the vendor who's leaving the door open for variations, and conversely also the internal clients desiring that so much is packed into that one word that means everything. We just want a server, which sort of comes down to being an assumption now, missing in any of the above. So the impact internally, if you have a internal software development part in your organization and your comms and marketing team are outsourcing to them, you have a relationship there, so it's a level of outsourcing, and it can be quite minor to major depending on how good your communication is. Basically everything that we talk about with external. But external can be much more complicated because of the scope and the parameters that are set in contract. And the communication is often very staged, very deliberate, and very limited. And I see one of the lawyers in the audience. Sorry to point you. So what we're going to talk about is very much the causes and the basics to minimizing the gaps. The experiences, or one experience from a complex arrangement, which Zeke is going to talk about, and then a couple of contrived examples to frame the lessons that we've learned. And lastly, a couple of considerations for migrating services. The central thesis is that there will always be gaps, and the task is to minimize their numbers and plan for dealing with their impact. As we were finishing this off, it occurred to me that having overlaps is also potentially problematic, but we left it out, and depending on how we go with time, that'll be a mistake or not. So this is your basic known knowns, known unknowns, unknown, etc. Over the life, you have what you know, the vendor has what they know. Over the life of any engagement, any project, those knowns will change. And going into some engagements, some of the knowns will never have been. You'll go and, oh, we used to be able to do that, but it probably never was true. And irrespective of what you have and what you want, they'll definitely be communicated poorly at some stage. The other thing, and I use the word you a lot, and it's not an atomic term. It's your organization, it's your department, it's the people within there. You is very broad. Similarly, the vendors are not atomic. So the requirements and services may evolve, and this may transition between the parties inside the party, if you like. The influences may be changing needs, especially internally, if your requirements increase, decrease. And externally, could be a broad industry direction, or the partner that you're working with deciding that they're going to go out of a particular service. In short, over time, the unknowns will increase. So to fight that trend, and for whatever reason this occurred to me, the Johari Window, which is all about how people know themselves and how they communicate with people, and of human interaction by Joseph Luft. It's quite old, 1969. And it's all about how you interact with other people and how you learn about yourself, how they learn about you, what they already know about you, what neither you or they know about themselves. And the same thing applies between you and the others, being the vendors, in your project. So what you want to do is tell the things you know about yourself, your requirements, your goals, your hopes and dreams, to a potential vendor. And similarly, the vendor will will tell you, or you should ask the vendor about themselves, how their capabilities and qualities will help. Now, the hopes and dreams, was maybe a little bit of a tried joke, but clearly fell flat. But we're talking about how your statements expand. So you've got your requirements about functions, how that relates to a project, and possibly how that relates to your mission, which is the hopes and dreams for your company. Zeke.
Thank you, Christian. So I guess we're a smaller company, so obviously outsource agreements may not be for every company, but I wanted to just talk briefly about why this is more common. So my absolute favourite is the businesses pushing more expenditure to operating budgets as opposed to capital budgets, and anyone who's had the joy of sitting through any cloud presentation has probably heard quite a similar line. But it is a common trend as to why people are doing this. So part of that means we're reducing hardware on site. There's always a strong push in Australia to reduce headcount. That's just a fact of Australian wages and where they are in the industry. They're very high. Businesses see outsourcing as a cheaper alternative, despite many arguments otherwise. So then what we end up happening is when we have smaller teams, some of this work that exists might be either too specialised, so it needs to go out, or the staff that you're left with can't do that work. So what we can end up with is these multiple vendor agreements, and essentially the more vendors you bring into a single solution, the more complex it is. It's really no different to any other IT solution. The more technology you pump into one thing, then the more you have to support. Same with your multiple vendors. So if we just look at what I'll be talking about, something quite simple, say our building management service. If it's in-house, it's not that exciting. There's a database, layer of virtual infrastructure, some servers there, and sitting over that's a firewall. Now we outsource it. So we've got a host who's controlling our virtual infrastructure and our firewall. Then we've got a specialised software support agreement who is maintaining software on our servers. And to make it more fun, they control the database, but they actually outsource that themselves to a different party. So, all of a sudden you've got something which, when it was managed in-house, wasn't too bad. You kind of knew who you had to go to. Now, in an outsourced, it's become pretty messy. So, what can we really do to sort of reduce these? So I guess I'll talk about the most common one, which is can you reduce the amount of vendors in your solution? Now I have to stress that going to a single vendor doesn't mean that it's more secure. It just makes the nature of communicating easier, because at least you're talking to one point instead of 7 every time you need to do something. But that's not always the case, so we really need to look at our documentation and communication. A lot of that is bringing up responsibilities through the SLAs. Dictionaries and glossaries are really useful tools for this, because that way you're clarifying that a single term in an agreement means the same thing to both parties. I quite like responsibility matrices. They tend to spell things out very clear, and hopefully what we're building towards is this clearer understanding of those responsibilities, which in turn makes it easier to communicate. And one of the other points here is if you do have multiple vendors, you shouldn't be afraid to talk to them all at the same time in the same space if they're all part of one solution. Okay, so just a really simple RACI matrix as an example. So R for responsible, A for accountable, C for consulted, I for informed. We just talked about dictionary and glossary. If you're going to use this, please make sure you define what those terms mean to your business, because that would be a mistake if you didn't. So in my example, we've basically got our IT department that we want to be consulted on everything, but our host support, we expect them to be responsible and accountable for OS patching and firewall changes, but we need them to inform our software vendor. and same with our software support vendor there. We want them to do the responsible and accountable for their software patching and the database patching, but they need to inform our host that this is going on. So really good tool like this highlights things like shared responsibilities and where you need parties to be informed. Okay, so if we look at our outsource system, this is a bad example of where you can have problems. So we've got our functional software support, we've got our host support. They don't communicate between each other. They always come back through us as a relayed point. So already we've kind of got some issues with communication here. We've got a pre-negotiated setup that's been handed over to IT, and I promised myself I wouldn't be too cynical, but let's go with IT weren't consulted because I can unlock my phone with my thumb, so I get security. That's a pretty good example, I think. So we've already got a problem where we haven't been kept in the loop. So basically what do we end up with is a huge amount of assumptions as to what's going to happen with this agreement and the support of that. So let's talk about how easy with the multiple vendors things can go wrong. So we talk about a port change that was made, not documented, so we weren't really aware. We've compounded that by the fact that we've got, say, our reporting server, which would normally sit internally, wasn't patched, should have been patched, but now it's open to traffic, and end result, it's pretty easy. Unfortunate, we get an end result and where the system's brought down. Look, this can happen really easily when you do have gaps in the agreement, and this isn't about vendor blame or anything like that. It's just showing that with multiple vendors, compounding poor decisions can get your worst result very quickly. So where do we go from this sort of point? Definitely SLAs. If you've got evergreen agreements, they need to be looked at every single year. SLAs are the same. So in this case, we want to go back through the SLAs, make sure we know what is covered, what's expected, get that communication increase between our vendors. If we find gaps, let's get them documented. We talk about information sharing. Well, this is sharing those issues. Definitely talk to the vendors about those gaps, whether they can be addressed through the current agreements or not. So to summarise my little section, security is much more than just the technical aspects. When you're doing an outsourced agreement, vendor management is extremely important. And I just set a note here for myself, because zero risk and presume you've already been hacked, pretty common theme. With vendors, it doesn't sound great, but we'll just presume that you're working with a terrible vendor. Please don't work with a terrible vendor, but presume they're bad. It's not it's not the worst starting point, because if you take that view, at least you're going to be building up everything you need, rather than a presumption that they are going to do what you want due to their position within the industry. Hand back to Christian.
Right, so I'm going to go on to the myth of perfect knowledge. Let's say your goal is that everyone is on the same page and knows what is needed, what is wanted, and how it can be provided. Over time, of course, as already mentioned, things change, but because you have achieved perfect knowledge, all of this is entirely planned, 100% staged, and the other parties only better align in terms of service delivery and everything, communication with your needs and wants. And the reality is, of course, that this doesn't happen. Things change. I know I repeat myself, but things change. That's constant. So you need to document everything and expect that the things that are trivial today, completely irrelevant, will eventually become a vital feature or pain. Suffering the consequences. Let's say your organization has a need for encryption in the system, in any system. And when you ask your vendor how they implemented their encryption, they come back and say that, well, they don't share that information for security reasons. which should be setting off really significant flags to start with. And the worst case, of course, is that the encryption is garbage, at the very least for what you're trying to achieve in this scenario. Internally, you might accept that vendor response. Your evaluation committee might not notice that this is an issue, and the system eventually ends up breaching. Externally, well, you already have one problem there, and that is that the client query is not being adequately addressed. You have a communication problem. This might lead to the sale being lost and potentially the sale going through. Irrespective, if you involve the right teams, be that IT, security, legal, procurement, all of these different groups, you'll probably notice when something isn't quite as it should be. And the negative effects that you really have to worry about, obviously, are the ones that are going to impact your company. The vendor losing the sale, if you're invested in that, there's probably something going wrong further upstream. The other example, and these two are going to be connected, your organization desires a high level of security through two-factor authentication. And yeah, cool, the vendor delivers, it's an option, you just tick the box. But unbeknownst to you, all the other clients that that vendor has have the option to not choose that, and they're all on shared infrastructure. So the security that you're mandating is completely optional to someone else. So that leads to the separate instance of a cloud-hosted service. And to me, that raises the question of separate what? Are we talking about front ends, back ends, the network infrastructure? How is that even configured? Is it virtualized? Is it entirely physical? Or are we talking about the logical on top of the combined virtual and physical? Are we talking about the stored art assets? So if the one vendor gets hacked and their company logo changes, everybody gets that. Or is it all of the above? One way or another, irrespective, you have to define at some stage what is meant, and that means you have to understand what is meant, because you might not have come up with those needs. They may have been handed to you. You need to trust your vendor that what they're actually offering is what you're actually looking for, so you have to trust their response, and rely that the contracts that you end up engaging in are going to set the outer bounds and not allow what you've mandated to be circumventable. Hannon's razor is listed there with a beautiful GIF, in my opinion. So never attribute malice to something that can be adequately explained by stupidity. Process and communications can break down in any organization. Yours, the vendors, entirely unrelated third parties. And perfect knowledge is never going to be achieved. Or if it is going to not hang around. The vendors seldomly implement bad service and provide bad information on purpose. And internally, that the Kevin Butler was a Sony spokes construct, if you will, who somebody tweeted to the key for the PS3 encryption, and that he retweeted. This is from quite an old story at this point, but internally, Sony, they obviously, somebody there knew that was their key, and it is blacked out in that picture, but you'll find it if you want to. You probably have it if you want it. So as again I said before, these entities aren't atomic, and you wouldn't provide your vendors with bad information or your bad misconceptions as well, but the accidental, the incomplete, the unsuitable, that's a different matter. So moving on to our transition to or through the cloud, and this is a little bit, contrived and making a lot of assumptions. But let's say you're moving your service that you have on site into the cloud. When you decide to do that, what we've seen a lot of times, and people will back me up on this, is that they replicate their on-site service. And the features that they discard or modify is by choice or necessity. They're very flexible. They sort of try to match up much better for their first migration than they necessarily would later. And the reason for the migration into the cloud or to another setup is based on strategic direction, possibly a cost-benefit analysis, a risk analysis should definitely be done irrespective of what your motivation is. But when you do your second migration, this becomes so much more complicated because suddenly you have all these additional pressures. So time, cost, lost skills, and the reason I've got lost skills is we were outsourcing a service to a vendor, and they decided that they weren't going to do it anymore. Was no money in it. They fired their team. It was going away, so we had to move. So the focus on features is much more complex because you now have all the lessons that you've learned from your first cloud experience. You've got probably some new needs that have arisen since you first went live. Then you had the scale back needs that you eliminated in your first migration or previous migration. You have the things that always worked, your old wants, and then your old needs, the things that actually, this is the service that you as a technical person understand. So the refined requirements affect the cost. If you have a lot of requirements, a lot of features, it's likely to raise them, whereas conversely, if you go to the bare bones, it's going to be cheaper. And as mentioned in the contrived example, if you have flexibility in your feature and you say that two-factor authentication that's currently mandatory, want that optional, that can leak to others, and that can be for good feature as well. So, yeah. And one final thing on that, in that migration, choosing a vendor, is that you don't want your current limitations, the things that you're currently constrained by, to set your expectations for the new vendor. So a couple of more considerations. This follows much the same theme. When you prepare to migrate your services, you should be reassessing your services, not just picking them up and transferring them. Your first migration is likely to have been that, but at this point in time, with the maturity of the cloud, you probably learned some lessons from that. So given that, there's a level of satisficing that comes with any migration to another service where you just have to accept that, yeah, it's not going to work quite that way, so you make some changes. The other aspect of that is you should be assessing your service and doing that investigation before you're moving, not whilst you're moving. You don't want to go, all right, we're going to go live in 3 weeks' time. Incidentally, that thing doesn't work anymore. And so we're going to have to work around that. You want that before you choose where you're going to host it. Even if you've changed nothing, the inputs and the outputs are the same, and that's what probably most of the clients will consider the service. If the platform changes, there has been a change. And being that this is AusCERT, I figured I should probably mention that a security AusCERT at that point would be advisable, or at least considered to do one, just solely because, actually don't do it, because then you can come back next year and tell everybody about it. Yes, so finally, cloud service generally reduce your level of control. So plan for how your incident is going to be managed, and if you're going to rely on a stacked service, say you're getting a platform as a service from one vendor who's hosting on an infrastructure as a service from another vendor, it doesn't matter if one vendor is certified and their data is secure. If the second vendor does not retain those controls forward, you're going to have a problem at some point, or potentially anyway. Lastly, time and the perception of progress. Douglas Hofstadter, it always takes longer than you expect, even when you take Hofstadter's law into account. It's extremely difficult to progress any project. I'm sure there's not going to be much disagreement on that. But things may drop off the radar, especially if you're under pressure to show things are moving forward. And as you progress, the requirements from week 1 are going to become an issue in week 6. And if you have a long-running procurement, this only gets worse. So you need to avoid trusting the statements that the vendors have made, especially when you then get a contract back and says everything before is void, but you're right, because it needs to be in the contract. You need to communicate your progress and concerns to stakeholders, especially under the time pressure aspect that I've already mentioned. And ideally have a framework, a procurement framework, a project management framework that you're working within, so things don't fall off the end and your check-in points are preset. That takes us to our conclusion, and that is communication and documentation is the key, and like so many IT presentations, documentation and communication is the key. So the minimization of the communication intersect points that Zeke talked about between parties is beneficial. Ensuring that the same vocabulary is used, so glossaries and dictionaries, creating the responsibility matrix, and documenting the limitations and assumptions, both of the vendor and yourself. That system redesign, that evaluation of what you actually need, together with the responsibility matrix, is really good at highlighting the gaps and the overlaps, and then working forward to address them. And security and service delivery are balancing acts. So one thing, I think one of the keynotes this morning mentioned this, if things just keep working and you manage to avoid the incidences and things going kaboom, people are going to go, yeah, it's cool, it's all in hand. But the reality is, you know, it's like a duck on water. It's a lot of action under the water. So involving all the stakeholders and checking the agreements with the legal team is a thing that, you know, has become my mantra. And seeking, I have no idea what that last point means. And I wrote it. Oh, right, yes.
Yeah, so what we're talking about, I'll conclude that point, shall I,
Thank
Christian?
you. Yes, please.
So I guess what we're talking about is, you know, we come from a smaller company. Doesn't necessarily mean that we do things better or worse, certainly worse in some cases. But, you know, I think a challenge for IT departments is to really insert themselves into the process. And I think in terms of security, that's probably a more common theme over the years, that this is important. There's a lot of the presentations have been about the changes to board level reporting and so forth. So I think there's actually a need for IT to be proactive, and Christian's talking about if you're aware of projects in hand, that doesn't mean it's too late to insert into that space. So definitely get out there and do it. Just one last thing on agreements, because I'm sure our legal counsel would be horribly disappointed if I didn't mention it. You know, agreements for the company are there to protect you, but at the same time, they let you work better with the vendors because they clear the air. And that's the same reason that vendors have their SLAs, but just keep in mind that all those agreements, they should be in place to principally protect yourself. It's not about protecting the vendor, and if a vendor can't work on your terms, probably need to look around. Don't change the agreement. Thanks, guys. Any questions?
Thank you, gentlemen. That was great coverage. I'm just wondering about the data. Sorry about my voice, not feeling the best. About the data, you didn't touch upon any data concerns that there might be going forward into the cloud, say, first time. That seemed pretty simple. You've just got a whole bunch of stuff and it's going across somewhere. But that data is your property, as are the relationships between that data. If you want to then shift for whatever reason, if your provider goes down or you need to go somewhere else for whatever reason, how are you handling the data in your contract? Because that's the major component.
So I suppose we definitely have issues with that. We're in healthcare, so our data has additional requirements beyond that. So straight up, it rules out a huge amount of vendors. So our pool's cut down straight out. But that should, you know, come from, you need to have good requirements analysis for that. And I think, I guess you as a business really need to work on knowing the data. We still need to do that with some of the complications with our business model. It is really hard, and getting vendors on board with that is difficult as well. I think we face limitations with certain things. We would like to move to the cloud, and based on how they can host our data and secure it, we can't. That's a healthcare challenge. It is tough, and I would hope other businesses take that same strong outlook on their own data, because it is very important.
Another aspect to that is, in a lot of the services being hosted, there will be a clause that if you terminate the agreement within a certain amount of time, the data will be gone from their systems. So if you consider Office 365, for example, there's a clause. I don't know what the duration is, but if you decide to go out of that system, your data will eventually disappear out of there.
Any more questions? Okay, would you say a big thank you to Zeke and to Christian for the last talk? Thank you.
Thanks.